The Housing Finance and Policy Committee will come to order. I'd like to announce that this meeting will take place via House Rule 10.01. The clerk will take the roll.
Houseman.
Present.
Howard. Howard. Sorry, I can't hear you right now, even though you're unmuted, but I see you're present. Tice.
Tice present.
Agbaje.
Present.
Bliss.
Present.
Gomez. Gomez. Hassan. Hassan. Heinrich.
Heinrich present.
Hurd.
Present.
Jurgens.
Jurgens present.
Olson.
Present.
Farr.
Present.
Ryer.
Present.
And then Hassan.
Hassan is present.
Fantastic. Madam Chair, we do have a quorum.
Thank you, Mr. Wilcox. Next order of business is the approval of the minutes from Tuesday, January 19th. Representative Howard, have you had a chance to review the minutes? His sound may have some problems. Representative Tice, have you had a chance to review the minutes?
I have, and I would move them.
Representative Tice moves approval of the minutes from January 19th. Any comments about the minutes? If not, we can approve this motion by voice vote. So if you unmute yourselves, all those in favor of the motion say aye.
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 Opposed, nay. Motion prevails and the minutes are approved. Members, at our last meeting, we heard from a number of nonprofits who are involved in housing. Today, we're going to hear some governmental units and the role they have in housing. I should say that there's one additional one, the Coalition of Greater Minnesota Cities. We are going to have them at an upcoming meeting. Our agenda got a little too full today, but that group is coming in at another time. We're going to start with Minnesota Department of Labor and Industry, also known, I think, often as Dolly. We have Commissioner Robertson and Mr. McClellan here. And I think, are we starting with Commissioner Robertson? Welcome to the committee. Please identify yourself for the record.
Good morning, Madam Chair. For the record, my name is Rosalind Robertson. Thank you, Madam Chair and committee members, for inviting the Department of Labor and Industry to present to the Housing, Finance, and Policy Committee. I'm pleased to be here today. My name is Rosalind Robertson, and I am temporary commissioner for the agency. I was invited to speak to you today to share a little bit about the agency and our role in housing regulations. I'll talk broadly about the agency's overall mission and work for the committee's information, and then I'll turn it over to our Director of Construction Codes and Licensing, Scott McClellan, to discuss the specifics of labor and industry's role in housing. Before I begin with my presentation, I'd like to share with the committee a little bit about myself and my history at labor and industry. I'm a long-term employee who worked for 30 years here at the agency until my retirement in 2015. I returned to state service in 2019 under the Walz administration. I came to the agency as the deputy commissioner and served in that capacity until August of 2020. Since that time, I've served as temporary commissioner. I'll tell you a little bit about the agency. Our mission is to ensure Minnesota's work and living environments are equitable, healthy, and safe. Our vision is to be a trusted resource and an impartial regulator for employers, employees, property owners, and stakeholders. The agency accomplishes its work through the following programs: workers' compensation, occupational safety and health, labor standards, apprenticeship, construction code and licensing. And then we have a number of workforce development programs, including youth skill training and the pipeline dual training program. In the interest of time, I will pass the mic to Scott McKellen to describe the functions of the Construction Code and Licensing Division and to explain labor and industry's role in the housing arena. Thank you for having me today.
Thank you for being here. Mr. McClellan, welcome to the committee. Please identify yourself for the record.
Good morning, Madam Chair and committee members. My name is Scott McClellan. I am the state building official, and as Commissioner Robertson said, the Director of Construction Codes and Licensing for the Department of Labor and Industry. And I too am pleased to be with you this morning over Zoom and share a few minutes about the state building code and how it impacts new housing in Minnesota. The slide that you have up before you there identifies some of the various areas that we regulate and inspect. We license a number of trades, as you can see there, electricians and pipe fitters and boiler operators and manufactured home installers, building officials. So we license most of the construction industry. And you can see by the numbers on the right-hand side there that we do the majority of that online. So that has really helped our efficiency and reaching out to our stakeholders. And you can see just by the numbers too, the sheer number of inspections we perform on a yearly basis and the number of permits we issue. On the next slide, I thought it'd be appropriate that I begin by showing this excerpt verbatim from the 1971 statutes when the state building code was established to address in part the struggle to provide an adequate supply of affordable housing, when industry was also feeling the effects of the high cost of building materials. So here we are exactly 50 years later, and society is still struggling with providing an adequate supply of affordable housing. However, one of the areas we did improve in is that now Minnesota, unlike 1971, we have a single set of codes that governs construction throughout the entire state. In 1971, every municipality could have their own set of codes, often having their own unique requirements that were overly complex, unnecessary, and not cost effective. On the next slide, there we go. So when we refer to the state building code, we're referring to many separate code books that make up the state code. And this graphic shows some of the model codes Minnesota adopts. Those specifically we adopted in March of 2020. And the Commissioner of Labor and Industry actually adopts the building code in consultation with the Construction Codes Advisory Council. This is unlike the electrical and plumbing codes, however, that are adopted by those boards, the Board of Plumbing and the Board of Electricity. Although statute requires the state building code to conform as much as possible to model codes, the codes can be amended to address our unique geography, our climate, and often special statutory requirements that are established, such as bleacher safety, window fall, window cleaning anchors, radon control, and some of the others. In the next slide, this is our statutory purpose of the code. And I've bolded some of the key words that our code is to be basic, uniform, and reasonable. Wow, if we could all agree on what that is. However, it is our charge to ensure that the codes we adopt meet these criteria to the extent we possibly can. And another unique feature in the adoption of our codes, it states there at the end to tend to lower construction costs. This is something that the department does work hard at doing. And our last two code adoptions in 2015 and now in 2020 do contain numerous clarifications and reductions in requirements that help keep costs down. Oftentimes it's misunderstood that when we adopt new codes, we're incorporating another layer of requirements. Most often that is not true. When we do that, those become quite well known, but more often than not, there are refinements in the language and things that bring greater clarity or even a reduction of provisions, believe it or not. One of the stated purposes on the next slide there of the code is uniformity. And I highlight this today because it's so important. And it's stated in the statute here 3 different ways, emphasizing that the state building code applies statewide and supersedes the code of any municipality. This means that municipalities may not, by local ordinance, add to or take away from any of the requirements of the state code. That's what they were trying to get away from in 1971 when the legislature established a single set of statewide codes. And the bottom line of uniformity is that translates into cost savings for contractors in bidding projects and homeowners and understanding what they're paying for. So that's the real benefit of uniformity. On this next slide, this illustrates that although the state building code does apply statewide, and that's been the case in law since 2008, it's not required to be enforced everywhere with local code enforcement. Where there is the code adopted, the municipal building officials responsible for issuing permits and performing inspections. In other areas of the state, there is no direct oversight on the building code. Now, there may be electrical inspection, well inspection, septic inspections, and in commercial buildings, elevators and plumbing. But at the residential level, unless that municipality has adopted the code, there's no local oversight. The Department of Labor and Industry does provide oversight on other types of buildings, direct inspections on schools and hospitals and nursing homes and places of public accommodation. And this is the printed version of our Minnesota residential code, and it governs a number of areas, including structural stability, safety with safety glass and guardrails and handrails and stairways and sanitation requirements, et cetera, et cetera. And other separate codes then govern energy conservation, plumbing, and electrical. But this is Minnesota's construction code. This slide simply shows, it's a snapshot of our website. It just shows the top 2 codes that Minnesota actually has purchased rights to provide online access to all of our codes free of charge for all of Minnesotans. So we've got plumbing, electrical, and a number of other codes, but this shows that our residential codes are, anyone can click on there and go to the current building code requirements for Minnesota. And the last slide that I had for you today is, in addition to conventional site-built homes that we normally think of in regulating, there are 3 other methods that sometimes homes are constructed to. One is the one that we normally think of as being a mobile home, but it's technically called a manufactured home, and it's built in a plant, as the name implies, but it's regulated by the U.S. Department of it's regulated by HUD, basically. And Minnesota is a state administrative agency on HUD's behalf to do local plant inspections and quality control. But the codes are all established by HUD, and they're unique to mobile homes. And there is not a direct relationship to the state building code. So those are exclusively regulated by HUD, except how they're installed in the ground. Those, then, the requirements are part of Minnesota's code. The second way buildings can be constructed is known as an industrial modular building. Sometimes these are panelized structures, but they can be used for anything, from an apartment building to an office building, could be a home. And they, again, are built in a factory and some of our staff at CCLD go out and do audits of those plants and review their procedures for constructing them in this controlled environment. And the last way homes can be constructed in Minnesota is as a prefabricated building. I know each of these is a little nuanced, but these are 1 and 2 family dwellings that can be built in schools in a controlled environment, or vocational schools or lumber yards. They can build up to 3 a year, and then they're later transported to the site for final installation. And in those instances, again, CCLD staff review those plans and perform inspections at that school or vocational shop or the lumber yard. So I thought it important that you understand there are other ways that homes can be constructed in Minnesota. And with that, that concludes my presentation. And again, thank you for the opportunity to visit with you about that. And I'd be happy to answer any question you might have.
And we are seeing some new housing models now. For example, the tiny house, the small house. Do you have, when something like that develops, I'm assuming your department would take a look to see whether there needs to be additional language?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Actually, that is a new chapter in our code this year that recognizes the uniqueness of tiny houses. So it exempts some of the previous owner's requirements for having to have a stairway to a loft in a tiny home and some of these other areas. So those would be enforced at the local level by the local building official, but there is a chapter devoted just to constructing tiny homes in a way that's more practical and cost effective.
And members, the interesting thing about this is churches have discovered that zoning requirements don't relate to their property. And so there is some movement in the case of some churches to build a tiny house on their property. And in fact, some of them have focused particularly on housing veterans. Mr. Worth, do we have questions?
Madam Chair, Representative Herr has a question.
Representative Herr.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a quick question. I recall last year, and maybe our presenter can correct me if I'm wrong, but there was some issues with consistency of cities filing their Dolly reports. And I'm just curious if that has been rectified. And I know that there was some questions about how cities were reporting some of the different fields, that there wasn't enough guidance so that everyone could report consistently. And so I'm just curious if some of that has been addressed.
Mr. McClellan.
Madam Chair, Representative, thank you for that question. It's very appropriate. In fact, in consultation with some of the home builders and the League of Cities staff, we had a work group about a year ago examine the format that the department was using for that reporting. We've made enhancements to it, refinements might be a better word, and we've provided more transparency in that document. Those changes have been made, and that form is now available online for use in reporting for the past calendar year. So yes, thank you.
Any further questions, Mr. Worth?
Madam Chair, there are no questions in the queue at this time.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Robertson and Mr. McClellan, for being with us today. And next up, we have the Met Council. We have the Community Development Director of Met Council with us. Welcome to the committee. Please identify yourself for the record.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm Lisa Barajas from the Metropolitan Council. I'm the Community Development Director at the Council and will be sharing my screen with you here. That each technology is a little different, so I want to make sure I'm getting you the right screen. Thank you. So as many folks are familiar, the Met Council does a lot of different things, and I'm just going to talk about our role in housing today. Three basic items that I'll cover, and I'll try to zip through quickly. I see that the agenda, the number of speakers today is quite large, so I'll just touch on each of these items, although I could talk all day about each of these items. So first, I'll talk about our kind of starting at the higher level, at the policy level, the Council's role in regional planning and local comp plans. Then I'll talk about our funding programs, and then our operational on the ground experiences in our Housing and Redevelopment Authority. So you'll hear from a lot of presenters today across this entire spectrum. The council kind of sits in the middle of all of these, both on the policy side with our responsibilities under the Metropolitan Land Planning Act, on the funding side with our Livable Communities Act funds, but a lot of agencies across this spectrum hold a number of different roles, and they all relate together in this broader housing ecosystem. And a lot of, while I've greatly simplified everything on this slide, a lot of counties also do things that local governments do, cities do, and vice versa. And as I noted already, the council also has a housing and redevelopment authority that operates some federal programs as well. So in a nutshell, these are the council's roles in housing, that we're responsible and directed by statute to define local government shares of the regional need for low and moderate income housing. We review the comprehensive plans of all of the local governments in the 7-county metro area to ensure that all of the communities are planning for the adequate supply of land to support the need for low and moderate income housing within their communities. We provide funding for housing development through our Livable Communities Act programs, and then rental assistance to low-income households within a certain portion of the region. Some programs go a little bit beyond our portion of the region. And then a number of other support mechanisms, including incentives for housing performance within our grant programs, and then lots of technical assistance, research, data, and other supports for local governments that help support the local housing ecosystem. So at the high level, our responsibilities for regional planning are how we interact in the housing market in the 7-county metro. We're directed by law to prepare a metropolitan development guide for the 7-county metro that includes forecasted growth, population, households, and employment for the region, as well as that growth allocated out to each local government jurisdiction, so by city and township, and accumulated up to the county level as well. We further a little too fast there with the notes. We further articulate the responsibilities for planning for low and moderate income housing in the region through our housing policy plan. And the goal of this most recent plan was to create housing options that give people in all life stages and of all economic means viable choices for safe, stable, and affordable homes. Within the policy plan, based in the statute that you find in the Metropolitan Land Planning Act, we further articulate the responsibilities of local governments to, starting from the left, plan for and provide adequate housing opportunities to meet the existing projected local and regional housing needs, to use land planning to promote the availability of land, and then finally, to identify the tools that they will use to implement land use plan housing elements that meet the local unit share of the region's need for low and moderate income housing. So within our housing policy plan, we articulate what that means for a local government's plan, what it means to promote land availability, to define what each local government's existing need for affordable housing is, what their projected need for affordable housing is, and then provide a whole list of tools and resources that local governments can choose to use in order to implement their housing plans within their comprehensive plans.
While that screen is up, because it mentions several times assuring low and moderate income housing. Last year, there was a headline in the newspaper that said, if you live in St. Paul and make less than $30,000, there's not a single place you can afford. I'm assuming that's got to loom large for you as these aren't just words on paper, that somehow they have to drive policy.
Madam Chair, absolutely. And that's part of that definition of what it means to plan for low and moderate income housing. So what the housing income levels are, I didn't go into all of this detail in this particular presentation, but defining what affordable housing is, what those income levels means, and where we have the greatest need. And it really is at that lowest income level, that what we call the 30% of the area median income, where the deepest level of affordability is needed and production is needed. before COVID, we were definitely seeing housing prices in this region increase at rates that we hadn't seen in quite some time.
Madam Chair, Representative Ryer has a question.
Representative Ryer.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Director. I have one question. You're speaking about development of affordable housing. Could you speak to preservation of existing affordable housing and how that factors into your plan? Thank you.
Director?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Madam Chair. Committee member, the existing naturally occurring affordable housing and preservation of that is greatly important and something that we further discuss in our housing policy plan as well. It's one of the greatest existing resources we have on the ground. So we provide a lot of technical assistance for local governments, but we also know it's a resource that is in great peril. It's probably the easiest to redevelop, but it's also in some cases the hardest to maintain because of the lack of funding that's available for preservation. So falling into a state of disrepair when not enough funds are available to help with rehabilitation is certainly a need. So on that existing need is where we've looked at that, and certainly factors into our funding programs as well when we get to the grant criteria as there.
Please continue. We interrupted your flow a little bit here.
That's quite all right. Thank you, Madam Chair. I only have a couple more slides left. So right into our funding programs. Again, I'm just giving a really top level view of all of the work we do. Our Livable Communities Act programs are also based in statute, and it's a voluntary program for communities within the 7-county metro area to participate in, and it's funded by the local property tax levy, specifically just for livable communities programs. And the intent in state statute really is to do these items, and I just want to highlight the middle two in particular, that creating incentives for a full range of housing opportunities. So not just housing affordability, but providing diversity in housing opportunities in communities across the metro area. So not just, a single family home in shouldn't be the only choice available to you in a variety of communities, but providing for a range of options. So increasing our diversity of housing supply, as well as creating opportunities for affordable housing. In 2020, our funding was about $24.5 million. We average about $20 million a year with different program reserves, turnbacks, projects that don't work out. Sometimes we're able to make more money available, but that's about average for us in a given year, and is a program that we do every single year since the inception of this program. And then I want to talk more on the ground about the operations that the council is also involved in through our Metro HRA. Also was created by the legislature in 1974. And our primary work is in the distribution of housing rent assistance through the Section 8 program of the U.S. Housing Act. You can see there are a number on the map here, a number of housing agencies within the metro area and their different geographies. Our Metro HRA operates in that yellow area and with the permission of local governments in that area as well. And taking on that, we do, while there's a number of agencies across the metro, we have a lot of partnerships because we know that folks don't just live within their community, but often move throughout the metro as well. So a lot of collaboration with housing authorities across the region to make that easy for residents to find a place to live that meets their needs, is close to work, meets whatever needs they're trying to accomplish within their lives. We operate 10 programs that serve low-income families with rent subsidy and serve over 7,000 households in our portion of the region. Most of our residents live in our region. There are some programs that we operate that do go outside of our boundaries that we do in cooperation with those housing authorities. A little more detail on our programs. Our Housing Choice Voucher Program, or what you more commonly know as Section 8, is our largest program that is supported by federal funding. And most of our vouchers go toward the tenant, although we do have vouchers that are project-based, so they're tied specifically to units. The council also owns 150 units scattered throughout our service area as well. That's known as our Family Affordable Housing Program. Those are individual single-family homes and townhomes here and there. We also operate a number of federal and state programs as listed here that I know that we could talk about all day on each of these items as well. And some of these programs go outside of our standard area that operate more on a regional scale, but are meant to meet specialized populations or specialized needs as provided by these state and federal programs. And then a newer program for us is supporting folks who are sheltering on transit, experiencing homelessness. We were awarded federal housing vouchers a couple of years ago to meet this need and have continued to get additional awards over the last couple of years to do that. We partner with our Metro Transit Homeless Action Team, with our staff and outreach staff in our Metro HRA to provide housing subsidy and services for folks in particular who are using transit system as temporary shelter. So that concludes my presentation for today. I'm happy to take any questions you have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Worth. Do we have questions?
Madam Chair, no questions in the queue at this time.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for.
Madam Chair,
Oh.
Representative Herr has a question. Sorry.
I'm sorry,
Representative Herr has a question.
Representative Herr.
Actually, Madam Chair, I was going to ask a question, but I know you're short on time, so I'll
No,
just
that's
reach out to the. Are you sure?
That's okay.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask really, thank you, Madam Chair, ask really quick. I know that last slide was talking about vouchers, but I'm curious if they're running into the same issues we're hearing around people having vouchers but not being able to be placed in homes, and if they're running into that same issues as well.
Director.
Madam Chair, thank you, Representative Herr. That is not an uncommon issue, especially in a tight rental market. Pre-COVID, we were definitely seeing increasing amounts of time that it took for our tenants to find a place that would take their voucher. When there's a strong demand for units in your region and not a supply that isn't keeping up, landlords can be picky, and they're not required to take Section 8 at this time outside of the city of Minneapolis, that is my understanding. So some landlords are just not willing to wanting to take folks with vouchers as a form of payment. We do have programs and for landlord incentives that we've been looking into to make that a little bit easier to bring more landlords into the pool. But certainly that in a tight rental market, it does get harder for our residents to find, and it takes longer for them to find places to place their voucher.
Madam Chair, just one quick follow-up.
Yes, Representative Herr.
And are we keeping track of the number of people then who no longer who will use their voucher? And I know that sometimes people turn those over because they can't get placed. Are we keeping track of the data of of rate of placement and who's not able to use the voucher and now they're no longer on the list? I'd love to see some of that data at some point.
Director, is that something you have now, or?
Madam Chair, I don't have it at my fingertips, Representative, but it is something that we do track. The length of time it takes for residents to place their voucher, how long it takes them to shop for their unit, and how many folks turn back, definitely, because it's how we also track how long folks are on our waiting list before we open up our waiting list. So certainly we can follow up with that information.
And if you have that and get it to our committee administrator, we can distribute that to members of the committee. Thank you very much for being with us. And now we have AMC, Minnesota Counties, and we have three people, Ms. Fortney, Mr. Dunn, and Commissioner Mattis-Castillo. I'm assuming that Ms. Fortney, the policy analyst, is going first. Is that correct? Welcome to the committee. Please identify yourself for the record.
Great. Thank you, Madam Chair. My name is Gina Fortney. I'm a policy analyst with the Association of Minnesota Counties. While housing issues weren't always synonymous with county governance or AMC priorities, we can definitely say that has changed over the course of the last few years. Increasingly so, our members voice significant concerns regarding the lack of affordable housing options, and homelessness. Commissioners across our state can agree that stable housing is and has been a foundation to a healthy community. These realities have correlated to more and more counties investing in housing support resources and advocating for state investments and policy changes. Counties deal with housing issues on a wide spectrum, including operating many of the support and safety net services aimed at preventing housing instability or providing a path out of homelessness, as well as the economic development side, where a lack of housing options has harmful impacts on the local economy and ability to attract workforce. Our county employees in human services, public health, or community corrections can attest to the fact that access to stable housing affects an individual's physical health, mental health, safety, and economic stability. It's a social determinant of health and well-being. On the ground, Minnesota counties employ a variety of mechanisms to address housing issues based on local needs. County Housing and Redevelopment Authorities, HRAs, work exclusively on affordable housing and redevelopment opportunities to strengthen communities. Today, you will hear from David Dunn, Olmsted County's HRA Director, with more information on the role of the HRA. You will then hear from Ramsey County Commissioner Trista Mattis Castillo on the county's role in addressing the housing and homelessness crisis. From a policy standpoint, AMC supports legislative proposals aimed at addressing housing shortages and affordability issues through additional state investments, as well as the creation of financing mechanisms, including tax credits, to incent private investment in housing infrastructure. We appreciate the committee's focus on the role of local government in housing and the opportunity to share our work with you. I will now turn it over to David Dunn with Olmsted County.
Mr. Dunn, welcome to the committee. Please identify yourself for the record. You are still muted. You are still muted, Mr. Dunn.
How about that now?
We got you.
Good morning. My name is David Dunn. I serve as the Housing Director and the HRA Director for Olmsted County. And I'm just going to spend a brief couple of moments talking about our role, both as an HRA and as a county entity in how we work with housing. To kind of get to the last speaker talking a little bit about how, counties aren't traditionally maybe one of the first places you think of when you think of housing. But as we really dig into the clients that we serve, whether it's through the child protection system, the criminal justice system, our adult protection work, what we really find is time and time again is that housing is one of the root causes of what we are seeing in our communities. Because of that, we really, as counties across Minnesota, do what we can to play a role, and I think it's a growing role in the needs of housing. Some of these have already been touched on, and I don't have very much time, so I'll be very brief. We talked about, I know the last speaker talked about the HRA levy, and I know that you'll have a representative here from HRAs later today, really looking at that role as your traditional role of providing the rental assistance and the creation and the development of housing. But what we've really found along with that and what we've done in Olmsted County is it's not just the creation of housing, but it's really matching those services and the needs of the clients that are being served by the county to the housing that's available. And so just one example of that, and like I think a lot of people here, I could talk for all day because I get very passionate about these issues, is what we call our Bright Futures program. So what we've been able to do in Olmsted County is we've been able to coordinate Bright Futures, which is a program that provides support for teen moms with Olmsted County staff and HRA rental assistance together. And what we found was a lot of these mothers were really trying to do the best that they could, but their biggest barrier was that lack of housing stability. Not being able to be in a safe environment really was that drawback for them to be able to reach the next level of success for them and their children. And so what we were able to do is take some rental assistance funds from our HRA, match that with the services provided by our Bright Futures social workers, and create a program that worked much better, much more effectively, much more impactful. And so I think the other role, the role that county can have there is that facilitation role, that community coordinator role, especially in greater Minnesota, where you may not have as many resources available. We can play that role of kind of to facilitate and to bring people together around the issues of housing. The other thing that we work on that's been briefly touched on, and I know will be touched on more, is kind of the issue of homelessness. We've seen this all across Minnesota, and unfortunately in Olmsted County, we're not different. The homelessness in our community has gone up 26% over the last year. And so what we're, as we work together with our human service workers and then really trying to bring that housing directly to the people where it's needed and coordinate those services, because we know it's not just housing that works, it's not just services that works, it's really bringing together housing and services. And so that's really the role that we've been trying to play at a very large level, is how can we help facilitate the housing needs of the clients that we know are being served by counties and how can we bring the housing together and do it in a way that not only has better outcomes for the client, but also is fiscally responsible. And just as I leave you, my last thing would be just one kind of stat that I wanted to bring forward. The monthly cost in Olmsted County for one child in foster care is $1,700. The average cost of rental assistance for a family in Olmsted County is $580. So when we talk about these things, it's not just that it's a better outcome, it's also fiscally responsible. And I think when we start to look at this from both ends of the spectrum, we can really do, and we're starting to do some amazing things. So with that, I'll pause, and if there are any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer them. I just want to thank you for your time.
We'll finish with the commissioner and then go back to look back to questions. Commissioner, welcome. This happens to be my county. And what I know from watching her is we may talk about what the federal government and what the state government do, but it is local government that deals with the reality on a day-to-day basis, because that's where the problems are. So welcome, Commissioner. Please identify yourself for the record. We don't have your sound yet. It's not coming through yet.
How about now?
There we go.
Okay, great. Sorry, it's all the tech. Good morning, Madam Chair. Thank you very much. As you said, I am Ramsey County Commissioner Trista Matas Castillo. I chair the Ramsey County HRA and our Policy Action Group on Homelessness. I also serve on the Workforce and Housing Policy Committee for the Association of Minnesota Counties. I'm really happy to be here today to talk about how counties are working and want to give some concrete examples. In 2020, Minnesota housing crisis became visible in a way that it never had before. Now, let me be clear, the crisis didn't just happen because of the pandemic, but it has been exposed and exacerbated by the pandemic. Nearly 1 in 2 renters and 1 in 5 homeowners in Ramsey County are cost burdened, spending more than 30% of their income on housing. Nearly 1 in 4 renters in Ramsey County are extremely cost burdened, which means they're spending 50% of their income on housing. Simply put, our limited housing resources don't meet the need of our community. The economic downturn and COVID safety concerns force the need to depopulate shelters, and people doubling up, couch hopping, or living with friends were forced to find alternatives, and it has left hundreds of people with few to no other options except to live outside, creating often large encampments. Conditions in the encampments have often been dangerous and offer little to no sanitation and hygiene. And now with winter in full force, we're seeing more and more explosions and injuries caused by fires. Yesterday in the early morning hours in St. Paul, a fire occurred in an encampment and it took the life of a woman and severely injured another. Although most of these encampments are in the core cities, their residents come from all across the state of Minnesota. In Ramsey County, we saw 10 times the number of people living outside in 2020 than we had at any given time the year before. Counties have responded. We've been able to leverage the unique funding stream of the CARES Act to help address the crisis in the short term. That's included adding over 500 additional emergency shelter beds in Ramsey County. We spent $8.5 million to expand our hotel shelter operations for 380 individual rooms through the end of December, and including a family shelter. We have roughly $20 million reserved to continue the hotel and shelter operations throughout the winter and to fund the newly opened Bethesda, which is under contract through May of 2022. We've spent approximately $13.8 million for rental and utility assistance, as well as assistance directly to landlords. Additionally, we've worked to divert funding from other sources to try to improve our outcomes. We have created an Office of Housing Stability to oversee the whole continuum of services to ensure healthy, stable, and accessible housing options for all residents. We've diverted nearly $10 million in capital funds from county projects into building and preserving affordable housing in our community. That funding has all but run out, but the need for solutions to fund both short-term is still there. In the coming months, as eviction moratoriums begin to expire, we expect to see waves of additional people seeking affordable housing in towns and cities across Minnesota that simply does not exist in the current market. Affordable housing is expensive and requires numerous funding sources to get off the ground. As a result, the market is not building or preserving enough affordable housing to meet the needs of seniors, low-wage workers, and those who make less than $25,000 a year. This challenge is anticipated to grow, placing further strain on the housing market and county services for all households. At the current pace of new construction, it would take more than 46 years to build enough units to house cost-burdened households just in Ramsey County, and only if all construction was dedicated to affordable housing. Minnesota counties have stepped up to help address the needs and recognition of the urgency we see in our communities. Without your partnership and support, counties will be forced to step back from this work with dire consequences for our residents and communities. Madam Chair, Vice Chair Howard, Representative Hassan, I want to thank you personally and in particular for the early introduction of such important bills for the good of the fight. HF1, HF12, HF21, and HF40 take approaches to the problem that we face for Minnesota residents statewide, with evictions and fear of foreclosure, important funding that can fill the gap now with our CARES dollars that have been spent. We want you to know that we are your partners on these bills and that we hope we can see bipartisan work on them before the end of session.
Thank you very much. Mr. Worth, do we have questions?
Yes, Madam Chair, Representative Olson has a question.
Representative Olson?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, and just more of a comment. I just really appreciate the testifiers today and the greater Minnesota focus. I know when we do overview hearings, we hear from the agencies and we get some focus on greater Minnesota, but really to show that our local governments and our counties, you know, especially I'm in St. Louis County, really step up. And so I've appreciated that part of the discussion. And I know for the city of Duluth, their legislative priorities of their top three, 2 of them are housing related. It's a big deal for us and our local governments, and I just really appreciate that focus.
Thank you. Any others, Mr. Worth?
Madam Chair, no other questions in the queue at this time.
Thank you to all 3 testifiers. This was very helpful. And as I said, Coalition of Greater Minnesota Cities, we're bringing in at an upcoming meeting. So we'll hear more of those stories. And then we have the League of Minnesota Cities, and we have 2 testifiers. I think, Mr. Lightfoot, are you going first?
Good morning, Madam Chair and members. My name is
Good morning.
Daniel.
Welcome to the committee. Please identify yourself for the record.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My name is Daniel Lightfoot, and I serve as an intergovernmental relations representative with the League of Minnesota Cities. I cover housing policy, and today I'm also joined by my colleague Irene Gao, who is working on sharing her screen here as well.
Good morning, Madam Chair and members.
Good morning, Ms. Cow, Irene Cow, right?
Yes, my name is
Welcome.
Irene Gao. I work with Daniel Lightfoot at the League of Minnesota Cities and serve as a lobbyist there as well. Are you able to see our PowerPoint?
Yes.
Wonderful.
Well, good morning, Madam Chair and members. Thank you so much for the opportunity to testify today. We wanted to provide an overview of the city roles in housing, and I think one of the ways to discuss the myriad of issues impacting housing is through a word map here, and it's important to note all of the intricacies that are present when we discuss housing and the city role in addressing the housing continuum. While cities do everything they can to attract a diverse array of housing stock and support housing opportunities across the state, there are many aspects outside of city control, including market forces, stagnant wages, lending partners as among others, as previous testimony from the Minnesota Housing Partnership, from a lot of our nonprofit developer partners have noted. And they did a great job in previous testimony of laying out all of the challenges that we all face, including local units of government. So I just wanted to point that out and give you a sense of all of the things that we're dealing with.
And Madam Chair, members, the reason that you get Daniel and I is that Daniel covers housing policy on behalf of the League. And one of the issue areas I cover is land use. So I'm going to take a minute and talk about some of the land use related aspects when it comes to housing. One of the things that cities oversee is zoning. So one of the great things and the benefits of the presentations that you've had thus far is that you see all the different levels of government and then who's responsible for what. Cities are responsible for zoning, which is the control of development of land in their community. And we're not just talking about housing when we're thinking about residential, but also commercial and industrial. When we're thinking about zoning, cities are balancing a number of things. One is what's the best use of the land, depending on where it is, but we're also balancing the health, safety, and welfare of the residents. Now, that's the big picture. It gets complicated quickly, which is evident by this next slide. So recently there was, I had seen the Wilmer zoning map from 1972 that was out there. And there has been a lot that's changed in the city of Wilmer, for example, in the almost 50 years. What you're seeing here is not only that there are different levels and different types of zoning over the course of time, but also the effort for the city. This is their downtown zone or downtown area, and this is the Renaissance zone. One of the things the city has worked hard at in this time frame is thinking more about the diversity of their residents, thinking more about affordable housing in particular, and what the city can be doing to help encourage and make sure that all of their residents are being served. So just in this one example, you see that the city is doing things like not charging for water and sewer access, not charging for city permits, thinking about ways to give free land that cities have, thinking about tax abatement or TIF, which Daniel's going to talk more about in a little bit. Now, let's say through the process, zoning is one big picture item. The other thing is there's going to be an applicant that comes to the city and they're going to say, you know, we want to build something within the city. And in the housing context, we'll say it's either a single family home or multifamily project. There are a number of different city departments that then touch that for good reason, right? So there's, you come forward with a plan, you work with planning and zoning to ensure that it is a sound plan or considers the things that are in city ordinances. Engineering takes a look at, well, what are you going to be building on? What's the land look like? It's going to be different if it's bedrock versus clay. Then it's going to be building inspection, where for the cities that do adopt the state building code and enforce the building code, they are then taking a look at the structure itself. Is it being built safely? The fire department comes in and takes a different look at it. So this is just different examples and different departments that cities ensure the health, safety, and welfare of the residents as development projects happen. One of the areas of interest and conversations that we've had at the Capitol are around some of the fees that cities charge. So this is just an example of the building permit fee and what's set out in state statute as well as state rule. While we can't get into all of the specificity and complexity of all the issues that we're touching right now, we just wanted to provide an overview, and I'm happy to answer questions or talk to individual members afterwards to get in more depth. But when we take the building permit fee, for example, what is set out in state rule is that an applicant comes, so there's a developer that comes, and they say, you know what, based only on labor and materials, this is what we think the value is going to be. The building official then, there's actually a very robust table that takes into consideration how many bedrooms, how many floors are there, all of that level of complexity, and verifies that the amount that they think it's going to be actually is. And then that it's a formula, it gets multiplied by what is adopted for the state, for the building permit fee. Often cities have that multiplier, that formula. There are cities that have actually not updated or increased that multiplier in a really long time. So I know cities continue to use a multiplier back from 1997. It was really great that earlier DLI had done an overview of the state building code. So hopefully we'll be able to build on that. As Mr. McClellan had talked about earlier, that it really serves as a standard for how buildings are built. The city role in that then is that there are some cities that adopt ordinances to administer and enforce the state building code. Not all cities do this, so that local enforcement is varied. And the reason why that isn't the case is it's quite a bit of cost to do so, or in their community, it just might not be a lot of development that's happening. Now, some cities have internal staff that do the building inspection, so you'll have an entire building inspection department, but others, and this is often true in greater Minnesota, they hire that out to ensure that we administer and enforce the state building code. And with that, Madam Chair, I'm going to turn it over to Daniel Lightfoot.
Mr. Lightfoot.
Thank you, Madam Chair and members. Cities continue certainly to work diligently amidst challenging market conditions to respond effectively to housing needs in their communities. But our members can't effectively address these housing needs alone. We do need robust support, both from a policy perspective and from a resource perspective from all levels of government. But cities are in the best position to respond to their locally identified housing needs. And it's incredibly important for cities to retain that flexibility to deploy the local tools available and tailor those tools to unique community goals, individual developments, individual proposals, et cetera. And I want to briefly spend some time on a few specific examples of some tools utilized by cities to support affordable housing and housing affordability. And these examples coincide with our 25 tools for housing affordability document that should be in members' packets. So this slide here, low or no cost city supplied land. Cities across the state are recognizing that the cost of land, which cities don't control, can sometimes be a barrier and are incentivizing development by either giving away land for development, selling it at a much reduced cost if it's a city-owned lot, or assisting with the cost to prepare the infrastructure for the development on that land. And you can see the diversity geographically of cities that are utilizing this, both large and small. One of the other tools is that I want to highlight are density bonuses, and density bonuses are utilized by cities to allow builders to increase the allowed dwelling units per acre in exchange for a public benefit, whether it's additional affordable housing units that are set aside for certain average median incomes. And density bonuses are used all over the metro primarily, but also all over the state with both single family and rental developments. Some cities have funded through own source revenue online permitting systems, which offer real-time inspection progress, updates, and online submission of building plans. And this certainly has become especially important during the pandemic, as many cities worked diligently to continue the permitting and review and inspection processes electronically to protect city safety, city staff safety, but also ensure that development can continue to move forward. Irene briefly mentioned tax increment financing, which generally subsidizes development or redevelopment by refunding or diverting a portion of a property tax to help with financing. And TIF increases that tax capacity and property taxes from a development or redevelopment to pay for certain costs. Cities all over the state use TIF to increase affordability for developers and home buyers, both on the single family side and the rental side of things. And it's been an incredibly important tool that is one of the areas we're seeking additional flexibility to use this tool for more housing across the housing continuum to ensure that cities can attract the diverse array of housing stock needed to support residents. And lastly, I want to talk a little bit about local housing trust funds. Despite massive shortfalls in revenue, cities are still working diligently to provide own source revenues that can go directly towards housing needs. And local housing trust funds are used in cities across the state. I believe we're up to 9 or 10 local units of government that have employed local housing trust funds to help address a myriad of housing costs, whether it's down payment assistance for first-time home buyers or helping with the actual construction, preservation, and rehabilitation of affordable housing. And I just want to flag here Representative Howard's legislation that's been introduced over the last couple of sessions to provide state match funding for the establishment of local housing trust funds. We know that there are cities that want to develop and run local housing trust funds, but just need a little bit of seed capital to get that fund off the ground and effective in addressing housing needs. And it's important when we think about some of these tools, who pays for this support when cities provide the support? And really these tools, whether they're mostly whether they're financial incentives or other tools, are paid by taxpayers to incentivize development.
Madam Chair, I just wanted to add really quickly that, thank you, that when we're thinking about housing, there's often a bunch of other things to consider, and that actually includes infrastructure. So when we're thinking about water, sewer connection, that service, as well as the building of streets. And so there is other legislation that the league has proposed in the last few years and will be proposing this year as well, to ensure that when there is needed street improvements, when there needs to be either wider roads or new roads that have not been there before, that is paid for, and hopefully that growth pays for growth, that we're not relying solely or largely on the existing tax base. So I just wanted to add that.
Thank you. Further comments?
And Madam Chair, just
Mr. Lightfoot.
lastly, thank you, Madam Chair. Regarding the pandemic, I just wanted to note that despite massive unbudgeted COVID-19 costs, cities large and small propped up housing support programs with their coronavirus relief fund resources. Cities alone spent over $1.9 million on housing supports, and local units of government as a whole provided almost $14.5 million in housing supports. But the response to the pandemic necessitates not just additional capital resources for responding to housing needs, but also additional city flexibility to respond to locally community identified housing needs across that housing continuum. And Madam Chair, just wanted to also highlight our 2021 legislative priorities. They look a little bit different this year, pertaining to pandemic response and also issues associated with systemic racial inequities that we deal with across a lot of sectors, but especially in the housing world. So we're seeking support to allow cities to adequately navigate and respond to those economic challenges we're facing due to the pandemic, ensure that cities have the tools to effectively respond to the COVID-19 pandemic and manage operations, and then partner with our other levels of government, state and federal levels of government, to create safe and inclusive communities and while addressing racial inequities. And just lastly, with that state and local partnership, there are things specifically in the housing spectrum that we are supporting this session. I mentioned the local housing trust fund state match, tax increment finance flexibility to address a wider array of housing issues, but also the preservation piece. We're not just talking about the construction of new market rate housing. We're trying to look at the entire housing continuum from shelter capacity all the way on up to market rate housing. And in terms of the grant funding programs through the state, we've talked about the Challenge Fund grant program, Workforce Housing Development Program, and then of course rental rehab for preservation. And Madam Chair, we've also talked about housing infrastructure bond resources for additional housing support. With that, Madam Chair and members, we're happy to stand for any questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Worth. Do we have questions?
Madam Chair, there are no questions in the queue at this time.
Thank you very much to our testifiers. And now we have the Association of Metropolitan Municipalities. We have one testifier. Welcome to the committee. Please identify yourself for the record.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Charlie Vanderarty for Metro Cities, and I will share my screen here with you. Is that coming through?
It is.
Excellent. So, Madam Chair, Metro Cities represent cities from the Suffolk County Metropolitan region, and we represent the collective interests of cities there. And I'll highlight some of the differences with and add on to some of the testimony that Irene and Daniel provided with some Metro-specific context. As Lisa said, cities in the metropolitan region provide comprehensive plan updates every 10 years, and each city is required to look at its current housing needs as well as its future housing needs. I'll highlight one of the bottom bullet points with the staged and orderly development. And what that does is provides a way for cities to stage growth in its city. And so looking at growth and the subsequent phases of development allows cities to right-size infrastructure and make sure that there's ways to pay for that. Cities partner to create a variety of housing resources as well as preserve housing resources. And that includes housing that works for people at all stages of life, from younger families to professionals to retired individuals and to senior citizens as well. And that's at a variety of price points. So looking at housing that's affordable to people in their lower incomes, to middle incomes, to higher incomes. So that's affordable housing, workforce housing, market rate housing, and looking at the construction of everything from single family homes to multifamily homes. Preservation is also really critical as well of that existing housing stock. I appreciate the question earlier from Representative Pryor. What that does is looks at both subsidized housing as well as unsubsidized, that naturally occurring housing. Some cities have rehabilitation grants and loans to spur investments in rehabilitation, and the seed money for those programs is challenging. And as Daniel mentioned, support for local housing trust funds, as well as abilities for cities to amplify some of their local tax dollars to meet some of those needs, is very helpful and very beneficial and preserves that existing housing stock. Cities apply for those funds to meet those needs, and there's state resources that this committee and previous biennia and the Capital Investment Committee have been helpful in providing. There's tax credits, and then there's the challenge program, which you see is around $15 million a year. There's a capital investment bill with $100 million. And while those are significant funds, they're still insignificant to meet the full need out there. Commissioner Ho testified that the state funds are oversubscribed 3-to-1. So there'd be another 2 projects that could be funded, but for limited state funds in there. And cities have done a lot to apply for those funds. They've put in local dollars. That includes TIF, that can include infrastructure help, that can include tax abatement, that has included write-downs of land and donated land. And but for limited state funds, some of those projects are not being built, even with strong local support. I'll emphasize that one size does definitely not fit all because of local considerations. I'll highlight that there's unique geologies that the cities respond to, whether it's large bodies of water that run through the city requiring additional infrastructure requirements, and also looking at what the unique demographics are. So everything from senior housing needs. So the picture on the right is from the city of Victoria with a project there, and cities are planning for what they need for their future residents and what their communities will look like. There's also various densities, and that can include across the region as well as within each cities. And so single family homes and duplexes and townhomes on individual lots, up to hundreds of units per acre in multifamily buildings. On the picture on the right, the city of Carver proposed the Carver Crossing here, and this received some significant public pushback, but the city knew it had a need to support housing development that would meet jobs at wages that earners and employees in the city were making. So they did a lot of outreach, did a lot of engagement, and worked with the community to get to a support point for this project, and then has seen significant support for future projects as well. I'll highlight some of the actions cities have taken during COVID. That has included local housing assistance funds and referrals to state resources as well. There's been food assistance, employer assistance, and as Irene and Daniel mentioned, virtual permits and inspections to keep development moving ahead, as well as investments in public safety and making sure that residents stayed safe when interacting with public safety officers. I'll end by highlighting some of the priorities that we have as an association for the metropolitan region, including policy and state funds as well. The Challenge program is one of Minnesota Housing's most flexible resources, and cities use it for preservation as well as new construction and rehabilitation, allowing seniors to stay in their homes. The state match for local housing trust funds is critical to amplifying what local funds there are and spurring more cities or counties and regions to make those investments to meet those local needs. And I'll highlight a deed program as well, the Redevelopment Grant Program and Demolition Loan Program, which allows cities to take previously developed land, demolish blighted, obsolete use buildings, and redevelop in whether it's on main streets for the business side, but also for housing needs. And that program has received a lot of interest in housing, and that's something that remains a priority for metro cities as well. On the policy side, I'll highlight the Preserving Local Decision-Making Authority and Preserving Local Control. Cities know well what their needs are and how to meet those needs, and a one-size-fits-all approach does not work for planning and efficiencies, both whether at the policy side, the growth side, or the financial side as well. Irene talked about the Infrastructure Accountability Bill. Metro Cities has been a partner on that. We're also interested in reviewing the impacts of what a 4D program expansion could mean. Cities are responsible to looking at the property tax responsibilities in their community, and we want to make sure that should any shifts occur, to figure out the balance and scale at a local level there. And also interested in maintaining some flexibility and increasing flexibility with tax increment financing. And we've heard some conversations around changing some of the uses and authorizing some diversions from the fiscal disparities program. We'd be interested in participating in those conversations, but noting that we would oppose any diversions from that program. So, Madam Chair, I thank you for the time this morning. If there's any individual legislators who would like any more detailed information or to ask a city practitioner, I'm happy to set up individual meetings or come back to the committee if a more detailed presentation is requested. Thank you.
And I can assure you and all the other testifiers, we are, every time your last screen where you make some recommendations relative to funding and policy, we are keeping a list of all those that all the testifiers bring forward. And that can inform our later decision-making as we move into hearing bills. Members, you may not all be aware, the bills are coming in rather slowly because there's a huge backlog in the revisor's office. I think I heard the backlog was something like 1,700 bills. And so bills are coming in a bit slowly, but all of this is serving as background to those funding decisions and policy decisions we're going to be making. So thank you very much for your testimony. And finally, we have NARO, which connects the HRAs around the state. And I believe we are starting with Diane Larson. Welcome to the committee. Please identify yourself for the record. And do we have a second testifier?
We do not, Madam Chair.
Okay. Welcome to the committee. Please identify yourself for the record.
Madam Chair and members of the committee, my name is Diane Larson. I am the Executive Director of the Itasca County and the Grand Rapids HRA up in northeastern Minnesota. And I too am going to screen share here for you. Madam Chair, are you able to see my screen?
I can see it.
Wonderful, thank you. I am actually speaking today on behalf of Minnesota NARO, and Minnesota NARO stands for the National Association of Housing and Redevelopment Authority, or Redevelopment Officials, Minnesota NARO, where I currently serve as their legislative chair. My objective today is to provide a brief overview of how HRAs are organized and their work, and the work that we do in communities across the state. First, Minnesota NARO is a statewide membership organization comprised of over 150 HRAs across the state who provide housing resources in every legislative district. HRAs are actually organized and established under authority provided in Minnesota statute, and it's section 469. This section of the statute provides the framework for HRAs, economic development authorities or EDAs, and port authorities. My focus today will be on the housing work that is undertaken by HRAs. As you can see on the screen here, the purpose statement of the HRA statute spells out what we do. We are to, first, provide a sufficient supply of adequate, safe, and sanitary dwellings to protect the health, safety, and welfare of the citizens of Minnesota. We are to clear and redevelop blighted areas, and we are charged with remedying shortages of housing for low and moderate income residents. Throughout the state, HRAs are organized by cities or counties, or even by multiple counties to work on housing issues. HRAs manage a portfolio of housing in our communities. As has been mentioned by previous speakers, we administer both federal and state rent assistance programs in partnership with local landlords. Most HRAs own and manage multifamily buildings serving low-income persons and families, many of whom are seniors or persons with disabilities. We also develop housing and administer rehabilitation programs to preserve the housing we already have in our state. Minnesota NARO and our members have worked closely with the legislature in the past and the Minnesota Housing Finance Agency on policy and finance matters. One of our highest priorities in recent years has been to advocate for state general obligation bond allocations to allow us to maintain our existing stock of housing. Many of our units are now over 50 years old, and while we continue to carry out general maintenance on our buildings, large capital expenses such as roof repair, furnace replacement, elevators, energy efficiency upgrades are beyond our financial means. The state has been very, very helpful in meeting these capital needs. Since 2012, we have made huge strides with approximately $45.5 million impacting over 6,600 units statewide. Although this investment has made a tremendous impact, we have impacted only about 1/3 of all public housing across the state. There is an estimated backlog and need of nearly $355 million in capital needs. So there definitely is more work to be done across the state to preserve this asset. Minnesota NARO and its member agencies have also been supportive of the issuance of state appropriation bonds for the development of affordable housing across the state. This is a financial tool that is helping the state respond to a growing need for a variety of housing needs across the state. Beacon Hills, shown here in this picture, is an example of a project where we were able to leverage state bonds with both private and federal investment and resources to create not only supportive housing units, but housing units for working families here in Grand Rapids. We too hope to be in front of the committee again this session to talk about some of the challenges HRAs have faced in dealing with COVID-19, as well as legislation that we think will help better align state and federal housing resources to serve communities across Minnesota. I would like to take this opportunity to personally invite all of you on the committee to get to know the HRA in your legislative district and communicate with them. I think that they can be a wealth of information to this community. In closing, today I would like to thank Chair Hausman for giving us the opportunity to introduce Minnesota NARO to all of you. And at this time, I would turn it back to Madam Chair and open it up for any questions.
And members, I'll just review one of the numbers she gave us. 355 million is their backlog across the state for unmet needs in public housing. Sometimes when we see these numbers, we think somebody's pulling them out of the hat, but in fact, we're getting the information from our partners all across the state. That's why when Homes for All put their package together last year for housing infrastructure bonds and geo bonding for public housing, they asked for 100 million for geo bonds for public housing and 400 million for housing infrastructure bonds. They got not 400, but 100 for housing infrastructure bonds, and public housing fared even worse. They asked for 100 million, and we had 16 million in our bonding bill. So we have a long ways to go. And that's the bonding dollars are a really good tool for something like this. And so I will obviously be putting some pressure on to increase that number. So thank you very much, Ms. Larson. Mr. Worth, do we have questions for her?
Madam Chair, there are no questions at this time.
We'll give a minute just in case any other hand goes up. Well, again, we have just received very good information. It's going to be background for the bills that we're going to be hearing and for the funding decisions that we will need to make and the policy decisions. So thank you to all the testifiers for a great hearing today. Our next meeting will be Tuesday, January 26th at 10:30. We're working on the agenda for that. We might go back and look at the federal money that's coming in that's promised for this next year. I think something over 300 million, it seems. So we'll get some sense of what the how the department is thinking about spending that. There being no other business before the committee, we are adjourned.